1989-1993. She was the wife of one president, George Herbert Walker Bush, the mother of the second President Bush, one of the most remarkable lives in American political history. Joining me now, NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, your thoughts at this moment?
Well, great sadness, a great appreciation for all that she did, for the grace, for the courage, her loyalty to her family, for the way she chose to die, because she went through this passage with tremendous faith, and also sending a message about individual choice. She did not want more treatment. She had been in and out of the hospital, and any of us who know what it's been like to nurse our own parents or to be with our own parents as they go through these stages know just how complicated it is. And so she made these choices for herself, and her family supported her. Her husband was with her as she was going into her final sleep. Her children had been in and out of Houston. Neil Bush was very emotional in an interview this morning, and others in the family obviously deeply affected. Our own Jenna Bush Hager expressed her thoughts about the woman that she called affectionately the enforcer on the Today Show yesterday morning. They knew that she had been very ill for a long time, and although there had been so much focus, of course, on the former President Bush, he's suffering from Parkinson's and in a wheelchair and very frail. It was she with congestive heart failure and with the pulmonary disease that really brought her down that was more gravely ill. So her health had been failing for quite some time. In these last few days, friends and family members were coming and reading to her, in particular reading from her memoir. She deeply appreciated that. One reader was Susan Baker, the wife of the former Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary, and Chief of Staff. So very close friends, people who were deeply religious, and she was very religious and increasingly so in recent years. So her faith sustained her. Her love for this man that she fell in love with 73 years ago. They were the longest married couple in American presidential history, and also she was the first woman since Abigail Adams, only the second woman in American history to be the wife of one president and the mother of another.
You know, in accounts of Barbara Bush that I've read through the years and talking to people that were around the Bushes, in every account, she emerges as such a formidable presence. I mean, Jenna calls her the enforcer, but this was someone who loomed very large in the world of what would become essentially the most powerful political family in America.
Indeed. She was more than just the matriarch, the mother, the spouse. She, in fact, according to Nicole Wallace, whom I interviewed about her yesterday, who knows the family so well, she was the best politician of the whole bunch. And that, as John Meacham shared his thoughts, there would never have been a President Bush 41 if there had not been a Barbara Bush. It was Barbara Bush who went to Texas. She was the debutante from Rye who fell in love at first sight with the Connecticut Yankee, and at a dance when she was still... it was, I believe, before Pearl Harbor. And he went off to become the youngest naval aviator of his generation. And she, as a member of the greatest generation, was at home. They married during a leave. And then in 1948, when he was out of the service and had gone back to school and finished his college education at Yale, she moved to Odessa, Texas. And if she had not moved to Odessa, Texas, and then to Midland, Texas, and given, in particular, her son those Texas roots, there wouldn't have been either President Bush. It was she who understood the feelings, was empathetic to the needs and feelings and strivings of more ordinary Americans than what the patrician elder Bush family had been used to, and even in her own upraising. And so that was certainly what gave them the ability to embrace American culture, the American West, in a way that they never would have been. If she had not been willing to move 27 times in 73 years of marriage, whether it was going to China as the envoy there before we had diplomatic relations with China, to the CIA, as well as to the United Nations when he was the ambassador there. And then watching her son become president, and then watching, of course, the disappointments politically of her son Jeb. and now campaigning as well in recent years for George P. Bush, Jeb's son. So many generations of Bushes owe her so much. The love, the loyalty, and the fierce pride that she had and devotion to her family.
I want you to stay with us, if that's all right, Andrea. I want to bring in now by phone Michael Beschloss, who's the NBC News presidential historian. Michael, this is a historic figure in American life, and at the center of a family that will be written about for generations to come in the American political project.
That's for sure, Chris. And, you know, oftentimes it's hard to know what the place in history will be of an iconic figure like Barbara Bush. But in this case, it's really easy. There were only two women in American history who had a husband who was president and a son who was president. One was Abigail Adams, and the other was Barbara Bush.
And, of course, she played those dual roles alongside many other roles that she played at a time of far more focus and intense spotlight than in the era before the modern media.
That is for sure. And, you know, she really was a political wife at a time of change in two particular ways. Obviously, the role of women in American life, and particularly American political life, look how different it was at the time that George H.W. Bush went into politics in 1964 when he ran for the Senate from Texas, you know, versus the way it is now. And the other thing is that the Republican Party that both Bushes got into in the early 1960s, that was still a party where there was a big northeastern wing. They had both come out of the Northeast, New York and New England. In a way, they sort of symbolized the movement of the center of gravity from New England and the Northeast in the Republican Party all the way down to the Southwest. And in a way, when George and Barbara Bush went to Texas as this adventurous young couple in the late 1940s, they were sort of preceding the movement of power within the Republican Party.
Andrea, I wonder where her sort of political center is in terms of the trajectory of the party that Michael is describing, because it has been fascinating to watch a party that obviously her husband was a name in Republican politics. He comes from a long line of politicians, Prescott Bush, and business holders and sort of stalwart pillars of the Northeastern Republican establishment into the party that it has become. And she's an interesting sort of person to observe that trajectory up close.
A traditional conservative Republican, certainly not a Trump populist, certainly not someone who would be anti-immigrant. I think on freedom of choice, on the whole issue of abortion, that's been a complicated decision for a lot of the Bush women. And I think that privately, certainly, I think she would lean toward being much more liberal than the conservative policies that her husband and her son had to follow, given the influence of the conservative right and the evangelical right within the party. But this is not the Republican Party of Donald Trump. This is the Republican Party of traditional middle America and also Wall Street, the East Coast, certainly Prescott Bush, the senator who was the father of George Herbert Walker Bush. So there's a long line of very strong people in their family and very devoted to public service. I mean, think about someone who had been not only the CIA director, the UN ambassador, the envoy to China, the Republican national chairman when Nixon was going through Watergate, loyal to a fault, but also vice president for 2 terms under Ronald Reagan, and then president for 1 term, and of course the huge disappointment in 1992 when he failed to win the presidency. It was clearly the passing to a new generation. And I was covering the Clinton-Gore campaign, and you could see the baby boomers as we traveled the bus trips across America, replacing George Bush, who never was the retail politician, certainly, that his son became.
Joining us now by phone is Andy Card, who's former chief of staff to President George W. Bush. Andy, your recollections of Barbara Bush.
Well, Barbara Bush she's a force, and she's even a force when she's not with us. her conscience will last for a generation or two or three. There's not a doubt in my mind. But she was someone who was unvarnished in her telling the truth, and she would hold you to that unvarnished truth. So she was a force, and the truth is, I consider her to continue to be a force because she was a true, deep conscience to her husband, to her sons, to her daughter. She was a conscience to anyone close to her environment, and I think about her all the time, and I'm not with her all the time. And I'll continue to think about her.
Well, it's interesting you said that, Andy. She was obviously she was the mother of the president when you were working as the chief of staff for George W. Bush. As the chief of staff, I mean, and this relates to something someone was saying before, she was a presence in that White House, right? I mean, she was someone that you would interact with and who also had opinions and views about how the country should go and how the presidency should go.
Well, it's funny. She never put her thumb on the scale of policy. It was always on the scale of do the right thing. And so it was less about the policy and would just do the right thing. And she had great understanding of the role that tough decisions are for a president. She knew that. And she would frequently talk to me, and she wanted to know how her son was doing. She cared about her son. And yes, he could almost always tell if I had heard from his mother. So, but she was a presence, and she'll continue to be a presence. But more than that, there was a tremendous love story that Barbara Bush and George H.W. Bush defined for the world, and it's a love story that I got to witness back in the 1970s, and all the way through the unbelievable successes they had and the frustrations they had, the disappointments they had. But their love was like so rock solid. And even within the last few weeks, I was down in Houston and I was having lunch with the president, and he had come from the hospital where he'd been with his wife, and after lunch he was going to go back to the hospital. And he said to me, "She still likes to hold my hand." And I was weeping as he said it. Theirs is a love story. And she knew how to give tough love, and she knew how to give soft love, but it was always love. And that's a great thing that I got to witness.
All right, I want to thank Andy Card, Michael Beschloss, and Andrea Mitchell. Thank you all for joining us for this breaking news covering the passing away of Barbara Bush, First Lady, mother of President George W. Bush at the age of 92. Joining me now from West Palm Beach, Peter Alexander, who traveled with the current president, President Trump, to Florida, where he is for the week. And Peter, I understand the White House has issued a statement.
Yeah, we did hear from the President and First Lady within the last few minutes, posting a statement just moments ago, celebrating the life of the former First Lady, Barbara Bush, speaking about her devotion to family and to country. The President with a lot of words of praise. The First family sending their thoughts and prayers to the friends and family of Mrs. Bush as well. But you really are struck on this night about the sort of fact that this is a president, as a candidate, who really ran against what the Bush family represented. You remember some of the fierce attacks that President Trump and candidate Trump lashed out against Jeb Bush, of course. Frankly, he said that her mom had swooped in to try to help save her son. He was biting in his criticism, which is what's striking as you hear the kind words, of course, from Donald Trump tonight, of course, as president. The bottom line, this president tonight continues with his efforts. He's focused on some other topics, hosting Shinzo Abe and his wife alongside the First Lady at Mar-a-Lago tonight. Their focus on North Korea and trade talks as well. But it will be interesting to see who represents this administration for the funeral in the days ahead. I wouldn't be surprised if we either see the Vice President or the First Lady attend, but that information hasn't yet been provided. Chris.
You don't think the president's going to go, is that right?
We don't know. It's possible. He's scheduled to be here through the end of this week. No, there are no indications at this time about what the White House's plans are, whether the president himself will travel. So at this point, it's frankly too early to tell. But obviously, there is a great fraternity among past presidents. All the former presidents haven't been in one place together before. Remember, the Bushes didn't make it to President Trump's inauguration, of course, a lot of it due to the failing health of the senior Bush at the time back then. So it would be remarkable to see all those presidents gather together, but at this time, we just don't know the answer to that.
All right, Peter Alexander, thank you. With me now, David Jolly, former Republican congressman from Florida, Barbara Boxer, former Democratic senator from California. David, your thoughts about Barbara Bush and more broadly the Bush family and how it intersects with the broad trajectory of the party that you call home, the Republican Party?
Sure. Listen, Barbara Bush was a remarkable woman. There was a certain grace, a dignity, a quiet power, if you will, to her presence. She and George Bush were the very first couple I ever met as a young campaign volunteer in Atlanta. They had flown in from their last debate in Michigan, that 1992 presidential race. The race had largely gotten away from them, but they arrived and spent the next 24 hours as though, win or lose, they were doing what they felt was right for the country, and they were going to win or lose with great dignity. And to your point, Chris, we can't overlook the contrast between the Bush legacy and the state of the Republican Party today. The reality is there is not much room for the dignity of the Bush family in today's Republican Party. That's a political conversation that continues to be had within the GOP. But tonight we celebrate a truly wonderful and remarkable woman.
Senator Boxer, what are your recollections?
Yeah, we don't know why too far.
Well, I have great memories because I was in the House of Representatives when Barbara Bush was First Lady and George Herbert Walker Bush was president. And they were very gracious. She was always gracious. But what I loved about her, and what I'll always remember, is that she was fiercely independent. You could tell. She was always by her husband's side. She'd do anything for her family. But she had her own views. And with a twinkle in her eye, as her husband had to move to the right on issues such as a woman's right to choose, she sent out a lot of signals that don't worry about it. She was still there for women. And she did it in a way I can't even describe it. It was charming.
You know, it is the course of the Republican Party and the family dynasty that she has now overseen for these many years, David Jolly. And to Peter Alexander's point about Donald Trump running against it, I mean, Donald Trump spent months basically calling her son Jeb a simpering doofus over and over and over again, and a lot of that was animated by a certain kind of anti-dynastic feel among the Republican base.
Sure. No, that's absolutely true. And listen, I admit to taking Jeb Bush's side of that argument and not Donald Trump's. The Bush legacy is one of rich experience and qualifications. Frankly, that contrast existed between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton as well. The Bush family and the Clintons each brought rich government experience that, as we saw in the last election, was largely rejected because of this kind of nativist tribal populism that Donald Trump has sold. Listen, there are many reasons to condemn Donald Trump's populism tonight in the state of the Republican Party. It is worth, as a nation, though, taking a pause to celebrate the Bush legacy and Barbara Bush personally for her contribution to our nation.
Senator Boxer, how do you think about the women in the Republican Party and the Republican Party that Barbara Bush was part of for so long and where it is right now?
Well, there's just hardly any moderates there. David will tell you what happens if you're moderate, if you even talk to a Democrat, and what Trump did to the Bush family when he went after Jeb the way he did, so cynically and brutally, was to take a wrecking ball to the history of the Republican Party. And, you know, you might say, well, Barbara, what are your credentials for speaking about Republicans? I'm a lifelong Democrat. But, you know, my first big campaign, I supported a Republican named Peter Baer for the state Senate because he was a great environmentalist. We had a different Republican Party. And, of course, the Bushes were part of that. And there was a big tent. I mean, Barbara was in one side of the tent. Her husband was kind of moving toward the right. But it was very different then. And the Republican Party has changed so dramatically, it saddens me.
All right, former Congressman David Jolly and former Senator Barbara Boxer, thank you so much for making time on this evening. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell joins us now from Houston, where Barbara Bush died tonight. Kelly, what's the latest?
Well, good evening, Chris. This is the mix of a beautiful evening in a city she loved and the sadness of this news. Barbara Bush passed away peacefully today, as you've been discussing, and this city will now play host in a matter of days to dignitaries from around the world, around the country, and from the pages of our own recent American history. The stature of a First Lady passing is always particularly notable because they remain among the most popular people in the political sphere. That was certainly true of Barbara Bush. It's true of First Ladies since that time. And it is part of where the American family has the opportunity to acknowledge what First Families mean to us. Those who serve in the office of president are about the days in and out of the difficulties of politics. The First Ladies typically give us some themes that matter. Tonight, we're already seeing the responses from lawmakers. Senator Cornyn, of course, from Texas, talking about the blessing she was to this country. The President and First Lady also acknowledging her contribution to the American family and her quest to try to help many more enjoy the real possibilities of literacy, one of her important works in office as the First Lady and an influence in the time since. One of the things I can tell you, having not covered them in the White House, but often in the years since, is that toughness of Barbara Bush. President George W. Bush, who I covered extensively, always talked about his mother as the enforcer. And perhaps the most recent time, among those recent times,
who lives in a pineapple under the sea? Absorbent and yellow and porous is he.
Wanted to take a small group of us around for a tour.
Nonsense be something you wish.
Mrs. Bush was there, and I could see by her expression the idea of taking reporters around for a tour was not what she had in mind, that enforcer quality, whereas President Bush 41 was in a mood to sort of show off their family estate there at Walker Point, which is such a treasured part of the family history. More recently, I saw Mrs. Bush when she was in New Hampshire a little over a year ago with Jeb Bush at a time when his campaign was flagging. And you remember the history where after having a husband and a son in the White House, she'd publicly expressed concerns about another Bush running, another American family, maybe their time, but she did come out for Jeb Bush, and that was a night where he talked about any mistakes he had made. They were his own, not his mother's. And it was a time when New Hampshire voters recalled back to past campaigns for the other George Bushes, and then trying to translate that to Jeb Bush. Well, we know where that history went. But on that night, she was a mother trying to help her son. We also saw her helping George P. Bush, who is a statewide official here in Texas. So when you look at the sweep of Barbara Bush's contributions, she was in some ways a very traditional First Lady. She was also the backbone of a family that had so much success. And now over the next few days, the country will come here to Houston to remember her. Chris?
All right, Kelly O'Donnell, thank you very much. Still ahead, a lot of news to bring you tonight after this break. Former Attorney General Eric Holder joins me on set. That's in just 2 minutes.
You're watching MSNBC International. Those 2 words.
Enforcing the rule of law in this country, the Department of Justice has been facing unprecedented and potentially transformative attacks on its legitimacy, many coming often directly from the President of the United States. There's no one better to discuss the attacks on the rule of law in the Department of Justice in this country than my next guest, the man who led the Justice Department under President Obama from 2009 to 2015, former Attorney General Eric Holder. It's great to have you here. First, I just want to ask for your recollections of Barbara Bush.
She was a formidable woman and exhibited a quality that I think is so lacking in our lives now: class. She was a woman of class. And I have to say that is true of her husband as well. I would not say that they were ideological soulmates, and yet I had great respect for them. I've gotten to know George W. Bush a little bit, and he exhibits, I think, that same characteristic, class.
You're here at this table at a time that many people feel that the Republic is in peril, that we're nearing a crisis point. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I think I've said this, and I don't think it's hyperbolic, that I think our democracy is under attack. If you look at the question of gerrymandering, the question of voter suppression. If you look at the way in which the norms that have normally kind of cabined the way in which government interacts with the people, the way in which people in government interact with each other, a lot of these things are falling by the wayside.
What do you say to people say, well, it's all held so far, the country hums along and unemployment's low and Robert Mueller is continue. I mean, look, you would talk about independence of the Justice Department. SDNY raided the president's lawyer the other day. That's a pretty. It looks like everything's actually functioning.
Yeah, our systems are holding, but they are certainly being pressure tested, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, the fact that we have the ability to say that a lot of this pressure is being placed on these systems and that they are standing in place, it's not necessary in a normal situation. That pressure should not be applied to the situations. The institutions in the way that they.
You want to get out of my fucking face?
Does the president have the authority to fire Rod Rosenstein?
I don't think he has the ability to do it directly. On the other hand, I don't necessarily want to give them any ideas, but I think if he were to rescind the regulation that...
You're talking about Mueller. I mean Rosenstein. Rosenstein.
Yes. Yeah. He could do that.
Would that constitute in your mind more evidence of obstruction were he to do that?
I'm not sure it would necessarily by itself constitute obstruction. The question would be what was his intent in doing so. But it would play into a narrative that I think leads one to conclude that the president probably has engaged in some obstructive behavior.
James Comey obviously making the rounds this week, and someone that you worked with had interactions with in government. What is your assessment of his character and his truthfulness?
I think he is a truthful person. I think he's a man of honor, a person of integrity. I think he's also a person who made some really serious mistakes. And I wrote an article after he held after he released that material. In which I said that, good men can make mistakes. And I think that's what happened to Jim in 2016. But in terms of his credibility, I think that that is a touchstone for him. He tells the truth.
He had something to say about you that I wanted to get your response to, about a specific case, which was the David Petraeus case.
Yep.
And this is him saying, I thought David Petraeus should have been prosecuted not just for the mishandling of classified information, but also for lying to the FBI, because the lying it strikes at the heart of our rule of law in the country. In the end, the Attorney General at the time, Eric Holder, decided he would be charged only with the misdemeanor mishandling of classified information. Did you go too easy on David Petraeus? Did you step into that chain of authority to reduce the penalties he faced?
No, I followed the recommendations of all of the lawyers who were involved in that case, including the United States Attorney, who had the responsibility for that matter, and taking into account all of the facts in that case and some unique circumstances, and taking into account the recommendation that came from Jim Comey. I thought that the resolution that we ultimately decided was appropriate.
It was not a political determination on your hand that David Petraeus, his political capital meant that charging him with a felony would be politically toxic.
No, that never entered my calculation at all. I knew General Petraeus as a colleague for a very limited amount of time, and in terms of politics, that never entered my mind.
One of the things about watching Mueller go to work right now, it sometimes feels to me like, is it true that there's just a bunch of really egregious white-collar crime that's just hanging out there that is not prosecuted? Like Paul Manafort's pattern of doing what he was doing with his various bank accounts and real estate dealings, it was out there in the public. WNYC reported on it. And here comes Mueller, and he puts down an indictment that tracks the reporting on it. And it makes me wonder, like, should I think that there's a lot of stuff like this that just isn't being prosecuted, or is there something special happening here with the people around the president's circle?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, there's a lot of crime that happens, I think, generally that doesn't get reported. People are stealing things out of grocery stores. There are people doing things in banks that they shouldn't be doing.
A lot of drugs moving around that never get busted.
Yeah, and but when it comes to the things that are truly consequential, truly important, I think that law enforcement generally, not all the time, but generally focuses its attention on those kinds of matters and generally holds people to account.
What is Mueller's strategy here as you watch it develop?
Well, I think this is a classic case. He's building from the bottom up, and people have to understand that this is going to take some time. We're only about a year or so into this. From my view of this, I always thought this was about a 2-year case.
Really?
Yeah. But I think they've been really moving almost at light speed, what they have done in that first year. But this is you're building from the bottom up. You build the cases that you can and try to flip people until you work your way, up to the top. It's a classic public corruption case.
I want to play you something that Mitch McConnell said about protecting Mueller, and I thought it was interesting about whether there will be legislation introduced. There's been some movement in the Judiciary Committee. There's some interest from Tom Tillis, Republican in North Carolina, Chuck Grassley, Republican as well. This is what Mitch McConnell had to say about it today. Take a listen.
There's a move afoot among some of your colleagues just to make sure the president doesn't get rid of Mueller, to institutionally shield Mueller from being fired. How do you feel about that?
Well, that's not necessary. There's no indication that Mueller's going to be fired. I don't think the president's going to do that. And just as a practical matter, even if we passed it, why would he sign it? I'm the one who decides what we take to the floor. That's my responsibility as the majority leader. Will not be having this on the floor of the Senate.
What do you think of that?
No, because you don't build a hurricane wall when you see Katrina 5 miles out from the shore. I think there's a basis for us to conclude that Bob Mueller potentially could be fired by this president. So let's put in place mechanisms that would prevent that from happening. You think about the chaos that would be unleashed in this country, the constitutional crisis that this nation would have to face and undoubtedly then have to try to endure. You can take this preventive measure that would stop all of that in its tracks.
Why do you think they won't do it?
I think that they are afraid of angering the Trump base, which is the Republican base. And we can't make that distinction anymore. This notion there is a Trump base, which is different from the Republican base, is inconsistent with all the polling, I think, that we've seen. They are concerned about making sure that their base comes out, that their base it votes in November, that their base is behind them. There are people who still have to deal with primaries, and I think at some basic level, they're afraid of them.
Do you understand that base is motivated primarily or in large part by racial animus?
No, I'm not sure about that. I think there's a lot of fear that this president has certainly stoked, and he has certainly used race as a mechanism to engender that fear. But I don't think that is a primary motivator of the Trump base.
What about Jeff Sessions?
He's an interesting case. He's a person, I think, who is kind of stuck in the 1980s, and the failed policies of that era. The notion that we want to, get as many people as we can, put them in jail for as long as we can, and think that in and of itself is the way to keep the American people safe, without really looking at all of the things that have happened since then.
Does it strike you there's a contradiction between the way the president talks about the rule of law when it's people like Rob Porter, who was accused of domestic violence by 2 different women, and he talks about there's no due process for him, and he talks about how there's no attorney-client privilege. He's a real kind of almost bleeding heart, liberal, public defender-minded person when he's talking about due process and protections for people in his inner circle. And when he talks about drug dealers, he says we should execute drug dealers and we should deport all these immigrants. How do you make sense of those 2 different ways the president talks about law and order?
Well, he believes in situational law and order. There is no way that I think you can resolve the tension that you have just described. He is not a believer at base in the rule of law. He wants to make sure that those people who he likes, the people who support him, are treated in one way, and those other people, whoever those other people are treated in a different way.
We're going to now do something slightly strange, which is going to play a game of Eric Holder, This Is Your Life, with an individual that you worked for the Justice Department who's going to come and join the table, who's a friend of the show. Matt Miller is going to join us. We're going to talk about what is going on in that Department of Justice right now and the attacks that are happening on it. Stay with us if you would, and you at home as well. We'll be right back.
I saw you. Where'd you go?
Eric Holder also joining me, MSNBC Justice Analyst Matt Miller, who's chief spokesperson at the Department of Justice when Holder was the Attorney General. We talk a lot in this news cycle about the independence of the Justice Department, and it's a word that has a lot of force and meaning, but I think for people that are outside it, what does that actually mean? Like day-to-day lived reality, how you think about it in the culture of that place when you were there in the Obama administration?
Given the power that the Attorney General has, the ability to deprive people of their liberty, the ability to actually execute people, that power has to be used in a way that is independent of any political influence. And so on a day-to-day basis, we made sure that we made our decisions on the basis of the law and the facts without any consideration of what the White House wanted us to do, sometimes to the detriment of the relationship that we had with the White House. Not anything that was necessarily expressed directly to me, but things that I heard, maybe sometime thereafter. Because I think in the Obama administration, the president realized that an independent Justice Department was something that was important.
What did it mean to you there, Matt?
Well, it was, I came to the Justice Department from politics and learned pretty early that you had to take this job, you had to look at this job differently than any job you'd ever had, because there was this culture inside the department. And you learned it on day one.
Damn it,
and everyone understands it, that you don't talk to the White House about criminal cases. You can talk to them about some things. You can talk about policy matters. You can talk to them about communications matters. But you don't talk to them about criminal cases. And you never in a million years would talk to them about a criminal case that involved someone at the White House or someone close to the White House, which is what has made watching this White House so hard, is that the White House intervenes all the time about the things that affect the president, things that affect the president's friends, and the other side, too, trying to affect the president's political opponents, still trying to get them to prosecute Hillary Clinton.
I mean, here's the president. These are just some tweets from the president. Everybody's asking why the Justice Department isn't looking into all the dishonesty going on with crooked Hillary and the Dems. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has taken a very weak position on Hillary Clinton files, where emails, DNC server, and intel leakers. Why is AG Jeff Sessions asking the IG to investigate potentially massive FISA use? Will take forever, has no prosecutorial power, isn't the IG an Obama guy? Why not use Justice Department lawyers disgraceful? I mean, this amounts to the president ordering his AG publicly to prosecute his political enemies.
Right, and that's a very frightening thing. And, our institutions have held, and I think our institutions will probably hold, but these are tests of our institutions, and we have seen these kinds of things in other countries in earlier times, and I think we have to be cognizant of that. There are things that are at risk here by that kind of conduct of the president.
But here's the thing, yeah, go ahead.
So the institutions have held. You haven't seen, Hillary Clinton being indicted and then trying to prosecute. But you see the Justice Department scurrying around all the time, trying to do little things to make the president happy. So appointing a U.S. attorney to do document review, coming over and meeting with the president to turn over documents about the Clinton investigation. You see them, freeing up a so-called whistleblower on the Uranium One thing to go testify to Congress because the president was angry and had his White House counsel call over. So you see all these little lines being crossed. They can't give the president the big thing he wants. They can't fire Mueller. They can't prosecute Hillary. So they do these little things to try to make him happy.
But that erosion on the margins has an impact, and it's something that we should not discount. There's not a huge line between having a system that works correctly and one that works incorrectly, and the more of this little stuff that you do, that line disappears.
That to me is the most profound takeaway from this moment. As I sit here every day and try to process this and do the news is, we think about the Constitution. Everyone talks about the Constitution. Like, all this stuff we're talking about, the Department of Justice, White House, none of it's in the Constitution. The Department of Justice doesn't get created until the Grant administration, if I'm not mistaken, and during Reconstruction. All this stuff about, the president shouldn't just direct people to prosecute his enemies. That's not in the Constitution. You could do that, right? I guess the question is, at the end of the day, what is stopping it? What holds it back?
There are norms that we've always had.
God, does that sound insufficient to the task? In 1789, 1993, she was the wife of one president, George Herbert Walker Bush, the mother of the second President Bush, one of the most remarkable lives in American political history. Joining me now, NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, your thoughts at this moment?
Well, great sadness, a great appreciation for all that she did, for the grace, for the courage, her loyalty to her family, for the way she chose to die, because she went through this passage with tremendous faith, and also sending a message about individual choice. She did not want more treatment. She had been in and out of the hospital, and any of us who know what it's been like to nurse our own parents or to be with our own parents as they go through these stages know just how complicated it is. And so she made these choices for herself, and her family supported her. Her husband was with her as she was going into her final sleep. Her children had been in and out of Houston. Neil Bush was very emotional in an interview this morning, and others in the family obviously deeply affected. Our own Jenna Bush Hager expressed her thoughts about the woman that she called affectionately the enforcer on the Today Show yesterday morning. They knew that she had been very ill for a long time, and although there had been so much focus, of course, on the former President Bush, he's suffering from Parkinson's and in a wheelchair and very frail. It was she with congestive heart failure and with the pulmonary disease that really brought her down that was more gravely ill. So her health had been failing for quite some time. In these last few days, friends and family members were coming and reading to her, in particular reading from her memoir. She deeply appreciated that. One reader was Susan Baker, the wife of the former Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary, and Chief of Staff. So very close friends, people who were deeply religious, and she was very religious and increasingly so in recent years. So her faith sustained her. Her love for this man that she fell in love with 73 years ago. They were the longest married couple in American presidential history, and also...
What? Well, the winners, the losers, the movers, and the shakers. So if you see James out there, you say hello. Be kind to our new brother, and show him that here on the outside, we always...
What's up?
Never mind. Good day. Oh, hey, it's Bungly. Hey. Literally videotaping one of my friends earlier.